there is this question Anna has posed a couple of times about why not keep the form of mode D as a transcendental, which you already know the logic of it, which we'll write down, and we could construct every step the way we did with the other modes. So what is the accidental form of mode D? What is the consistent local form, the consistent global form? What are real atoms of mode D? And so on and so forth. And I think that there are two arguments against that, or my position. One is that I don't know how to do that. Like, there is no particular logic for that. We kind of used all versions of it already. Where we actually did something that hardcore Platonists would be very happy, because if we are right, the idea of justice does not coincide with any particular social logic. So you need to separate the idea of justice from just applying a logic consistently, right? Which sounds very cool for me politically, that ultimately a just system is not the same as follow mode C all the way, right? Something crazy like that. But I mean, that's a personal thing. We don't need to go into that right now. But the second thing is that dialecticism is just, it fits into what we call mode A. We don't have a separate logic, and we don't know the name of these things. Like, we know the name of local structures that we could call socialist ones, but more than accidental form of these things, we don't know exactly examples of it. So it sounds it would sound like a philosophical speculation rather than the same type of work we've been doing. And I find that also, again, personal position here, I'm not sure if everyone agrees on this, I do find that it's the sort of thing that it's very interesting to think that you're thinking as if you're embedded in that process rather than from the outside. And if you're embedded in that process, which is exactly how we try to organize org, like it's looking at the other logics, right? And looking, it's meant to be the way organizations interact by negating these different logics. It's like you're describing mode D, but describing mode D is to describe the other three from the standpoint of their negation, concrete negation. So that's already being done. Like, that's the whole point from that perspective, right? There is good reason for it not to take the form of just sociological description of something we can just kind of sketch how it looks from the outside, I guess. But I wouldn't want to kind of take too much time of this, just because Caron said he got lost in the discussion. And the discussion started just with this discussion over should mode D be kind of a more Kantian ethical injunction that then builds into a social logic. This would be more Kantian inclined. Subversion would take the form of more contradictions and like things like this, versus this other version we're dealing where it's like experiments first. You don't get to spell out the general form of the categories of socialism. And
so just to, the thing is, what's funny is I agree with most of what you're saying, even as it's framed kind of as a critique of what I've been saying. Like, I'm not quite saying I think what you think I've been trying to argue quite in that way. I mean, I actually really like the point that you make about how org is kind of like almost coming back around to mode D without actually posing it positively as another thing, like it's the negation within those other logics. I guess in a way, the main thing that I'm interested in is, in that sense, rather than trying to say, well, there's a particular form of mode D that works just like the other ones. I don't think it would be working just like the other ones, at least not with the tools we have right now. But like in the ways that we analyze existing multi-layered transcendentals, I think there might be better ways to at least just write org somehow more into those processes, or like try to look for ways where it might potentially be coming up in those processes. Or, in terms of mode D, or just in terms of org as we have it now. Because like you say, like, I mean, I've been trying to do some research on like, points in formal logic where there might be spaces to pursue some of this stuff. And like what actually I ended up coming up with, rather than, like we discussed this a little bit, rather than finding anything that actually could be a form of MOD, I kind of, found this problem happening where it's like, looking at what I was talking about with fuzzy pair consistent logics, where even there, you can't get the whole thing. You end up getting a little bit more of one side or a little bit more of the other side, no matter how much of it you try to combine. And that sort of is reinforcing this idea, I guess I have, where it's like, to the extent that we even have like a logic of MOD, it would rather be sort of detecting in logic, not detecting in logic something that isn't logic in a way where it's like, this is maybe getting into a whole other complex philosophical question, but I feel like it's like, not necessarily saying this follows from this logic or this is equivalent to this logic, but it's sort of looking for something that maybe we can't judge logically, but that, we can sort of recognize certain effects of it by relating it to other things in almost sort of like a transcritical way. I guess that's sort of more, if that makes any sense, how I was kind of approaching it. And yeah, I mean, I think it's important. Like, I don't want it to seem like we're like, we have these very, very different positions on this, because I don't really think that we do. But anyway, that's sort of just, if that helps at all.
Yep, I think I'm up, right? Yeah, I have also some questions about MOD. I wouldn't say that. Of course, maybe there is a strange asymmetry in Karatani, where you can find different logics that correspond to modes A, B, and C. Maybe you can't really find a specific logic that corresponds to D. But I do think that D is there to provide a normative kind of horizon. In the sense that the normative element is not directed toward a specific state of affairs so much as a kind of evaluation to be taken in an immanent form to the ways the organization unfold and relate to each other, something like that. Because if you just take my misgiving with just org bigger than K is that I have not saying that there's no difference, but I have a problem differentiating that from, for instance, this is why I'm interested in the far right and the idea of patchwork, differentiating between org bigger than K and the patchwork. Because, for instance, if you read the people that are interested in the patchwork, they say just that all they want is fragmentation. And through the fragmentation of organizational forms, they will have like a kind of competition, like a market of, organizational forms. And the best ones will be adopted, law of the market, something like that. In a certain sense, you could say that then org is not bigger than K for them, because, K seems to be the infrastructure for the ecology of organizations. But that is only the case if you think that market equals capital as well. So if market is different capital, maybe this is not the reverse of what we are saying, like which means it's not K bigger than org. And also, if market is not capital, I would think of what is the infrastructure then of org bigger than K in our framework. What is exactly the logic that will capture? I'm not thinking of logic in the abstract sense of power consistency or intuitionistic or classical logic, but isn't it a kind of market in a certain sense as well? So,
but why a market?
In the sense of having competition between different kinds of organizations, and some are better, equipped to deal with the problem, so they thrive, and other, we
but I think you gave a perfect description of why patchwork in the right is a reactionary thing, because
you think K is bigger than org for them.
No, because they literally say competition is to organization what evolution is to natural things. So you put organizational forms to compete, this will expand the world, but competition is a very particular social form.
Yeah, but it's in a meta level. I'm wondering, for instance, in our framework, we don't really have a defined meta level. We want to leave it maybe open, but then I feel that there is no normative element that will adjudicate between, something like the patchwork and something like, something that would unfold into a communist form or somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I would just separate the levels there, because I don't think you need, I mean, is there any problem of mentioning things like cooperation, solidarity,
No.
So we can mention a bunch of cool normative principles which are neither mode A, B, or C, right? That's easy. That's not hard. And that isn't good enough to normatively discriminate between like.
I think this should be in the framework. I think this will be clear, because me and Moscardi, we are preparing something on the patchwork. Perhaps I feel that this will be clearer if we do a more thorough kind of comparison, because this is kind of unstated, right, in the framework of the STP. So therefore, it seems like mode B carries with it a certain kind of normative import that just org is bigger than K. It seems to be like a descriptive kind of a statement and not a normative one. So you see, of course, maybe you could interpret in some normative way, but it seems to me you're smuggling in something. It's not really in the framework. So I'm kind of bothered with that.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure about like, I just think that if you ask questions of an idea that it's not meant to answer, it just will fall short, of course. But like the idea that it is thinkable that you can have more stuff than you have when capitalist state or communities dominate, it's a very simple statement. Now, that's the difference between, let's say, just the hypothesis that it is likely to a normative principle that gives you some purview of what this looks like concretely. I just don't think that one thing is meant to answer the second. Like the second question, we have many ways of answering, I just have the impression that it's interesting to distinguish, and I think we're doing a good job of distinguishing the two between, let's say, org is answering, before it answers any questions we have politically the name for, it's answering a formal question, which is very nice. You guys wrote A, B, and C. Where do you get to see this? Like by the combination of two principles, that there are these three logics and that you can only see social logics from social perspectives. Where will we be seeing these things from? Well, you need to name that standpoint. Cool. It's very cool that Bogdanov named it the organizational point of view, and it's kind of what it is, right? So you need to be able to take a point of view where you're only seeing the logics, right? Then where you can see all of them, and where you can see something like through interacting with them, right? So therefore, something that might resist them. So that minimal kind of point of view you need to be able to add to your formalism to make the idea of ABC consistent. Right? It already carries the first trait of mode D, which is the idea of transcendence. Like you transcend yourself, which is like a religious, philosophical idea. It's already there because it's seeing something by negating it. So it captures that idea without importing all the rest of mode D. So it's not becoming directly a normative principle, but it's carrying the epistemological point. But then if you want to let's say, construct a political body, you don't want to go too fast because, for example, I think a really good critique of like the patchwork ideology is that, yeah, I mean, insofar as it is in the head of a bunch of right-wingers who are writing books, it should go into our project not as a social movement that we have trouble locating. We should add it as, existing organizationally as a bunch of people meeting to do things, the things they do. Not what they're saying. Does it expand the world at all or not? Because like I can have the ideology, like a futuristic ideology of, I can have a futurist in the kind of the fascist Italian sense of like speeding reality towards new things. But let's not take the Jews there, like in the content, it sounds expensive and you might have trouble locating it. But when you look organizationally what it's doing, it's pretty standard. So I wouldn't necessarily let's say, find it to be contradictory. So I would just leave the org as the point of view. And then when we want to find, okay, but what are the actual things that function as this growths away from the world as it is, that suggest that you need more normative principles? Then I don't care where you take the name from. If you call it MOD, if you call it communist principles, if you call it the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, if you call it like a weirdly reactionary conservative religious idea, if the organization of people changes in a way that includes more and more people, more and more forms of association, because of that, the content of the idea doesn't sound so appealing. It's secondary, right? So, but it's interesting to keep first open that gap, to name that gap organizationally, and then to fill it in with concrete stuff that we can find, right? I have the impression MOD just does all those things at once, and we do want to keep all the ideas.
Yeah. I'm not advocating for MOD as it is, but I feel you need a means to adjudicate between, certain kinds of relation. I wouldn't say between social formations, but between certain kinds of meta stability in organizational ecologies. So Daniel is saying something like this here, like it seems like the multiplicity principle implies there are multiple normative principles, so different conceptions of freedom versus domination. Yeah, that's true, but at the same time, if you want to uphold multiplicity, you are it's mandatory in a certain sense, not in the sense that you have to do it, but in the sense that it emerges then a certain logic of relationship between these, these little islands of different normative principles. So what kind of relationship hold between them? For instance, in the patchwork, they explicitly think of it as a kind of market of organizations, whereas here it's not clear to me what kind of relationship. And this is because it seems to me to have like an overlap in the way we think of, org is bigger than K, and what the patchwork is thinking in terms of, having fragmentation, and the fragmentation being an opportunity for experimentation with organizational forms. So where is exactly, the criterion, therefore, normative kind of thing, right? The criterion by which we, measure whether something is, expanding the world or not, in a certain sense, because it's kind of quick and easy to say, oh, Moldbug, Nick Land, those are racist and all that. But at the same time, it seems to me that you could interpret, all the, bad things that they say as actually kind of a superstructural added thing, because the basic idea is to have fragmentation and experimentation with organizational forms because of fragmentation. So I think it's not that easy to, dismiss a possible relationship to what they're saying. And this is what is interesting to me, and why I think we need kind of not really MOD in its fullest, but a certain kind of way of describing things that make appear what is desirable about the ecology. Not to say that, oh, it's part of the ecology, therefore it's good, but in terms of differentiating between kinds of ecology, not just kinds of organization. It seems you have to jump to the background again, like you have a further meta level there.
But I think, don't you feel like that's exactly where we are right now? Because at the end of this paper, we have 3 levels to differentiate between this concepts. We have 4 levels, right? We have the organization, the ecology, and then on top of it, and on top of everything, we have org, right? So, and actually we have also the world. So like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different places to distinguish, like a sort of combined, enriched normative principle where things are.
I think we have tools for doing it. I'm just saying maybe we have to do it. You see,
we're trying. We're trying to put everyone on the same same page regarding what we already have.
I think there are tools. I think they are promising. I'm not saying that it's bad, but it seems to me that there's some kind of normative evaluation needed somewhere. to differentiate between the ecologies in a
Yeah.
certain sense. We are working with the hypothesis of the reactionary being like what's it called, the shortage of the world, like it's not the expansion, right?
Reduction kind of.
Reduction of the world, and the emancipatory and expansion of the world, and the conservative let the world stay as it is. But I fear, it's more like something that I fear. Fear is too strong, like é receio. I feel that perhaps this is under-determining, for instance, the difference that might obtain between what we are doing and what the patchwork is doing, because there are discourses also about, yeah, you need to have more spaces of organization because everything is so fucked up. And even they have this, ideological discourse against the cathedral. The cathedral is basically a certain kind of, very reduced diet of organizational forms, which because they portray themselves as right-wing, they, connect to, bureaucracy, basically, and read, for instance, communism as a kind of bureaucracy. So I think there is a kind of an overlap there, or maybe an underdetermination on where we stand regarding that kind of thing, So this is why I think there is something needed. Of course, I agree with you. We have tools maybe for developing this, but I'm just saying out loud that for everybody that maybe this is something we should think about, just that.
No, I totally agree. I just really trust that we have tools you don't need to go that far to show that this sort of, organization and the market of organizations, and that, accelerationism in many of its forms, it's not only more reductive than it looks in its ideas, but in practice, I'm still trying. I know the talk of organizational forms, but what is this new thing they have to show for?
Yeah, for instance, if you think just of the ecology of accelerationism, as you mentioned now, for instance, these people from the patchwork, they are not all of them, but they are kind of related to right accelerationism or unconditional accelerationism, something like that. And if you compare to left accelerationism, it seems that it is warranted, the critique that left accelerationism is bureaucratic. So it's kind of weird. Like the problem is that from what I read, they feel that capital or the market, you have like a kind of difficult kind of discussion right there. But anyway, some say that capital is, the final horizon. So this is why, you have right-wing acceleration is like Nick Land. He says like, experimentation comes from capital. In a certain sense. So of course, K is bigger than org for him. But I'm not sure, for instance, this obtains for Moldbug or for other people. They think of market in a certain sense. So I'm not sure if this is the same as well. But anyway, this. And left accelerationism seems to be too restrictive as well, organizationally. I was always, as sympathetic to it, but at the same time, I always thought it was more like a government program than any kind of good toolbox for political organizations. It's more like okay, we have Corbyn and you have Sanders, and maybe if you apply these measures, these policies, everything will be okay. It's something that is presupposing the already existent kind of democratic system, and perhaps a kind of a Gramscian kind of shift of the democratic system from within the electoral procedure. But this is very restrictive, right? Like it's a tactic, really. It's not really a framework for thinking political organization at large, really. So,
can I just join in for a bit? Because I think I don't think too many things on my mind, but just for starters, I think there's this, like, you're going too much against like the evidence on what, you're still going to do that bring in those sacred texts of those people, the the new reactionary mode deers that are the dark enlightenment people. But I think that, for instance, I mean, if you take their own account of what they are doing, they are like negating all other types of logics that would, all other principles of adjudication. I don't know how you say those things in this normative language. But I mean, if you take like, for example, the Moldbugian or the Landian description of social forms, it's like, I'm sorry, my cat is going to do some. The market is the only criteria. So I cannot see how, in a sense, it would be any type of expansion in regards to free association. There's only one logic of free association at play there.
It's a meta logic. He wants fragmentation because every singular form of organization is its own. So it's trickier than that.
But he can say that. But when it takes a form where the only logic that is going on there is the logic of market, that is the only criteria. I mean, it's.
I don't think it's the only criterion. This is a problem.
But it's like I think there's this problem. I mean, this is going to sound stupid, but I think it's the same problem that appears in the Gorgias of Plato. There's this defense of force as the ultimate criteria for justice. And Socrates' answer is, well, okay, but the problem is that if force is the criteria, the weak have been shown to be stronger in their forms of association that are not immediately those that you are putting. So in a sense, like they are not, they have to negate many forms of many qualities of association so that they can put this overarching fragmentation with an economic logic, which is always said, also, and you can see it in the descriptions. States are corporations, citizens can leave and go just like a customer. I mean, I think there's a negating of many logics. I think that's like a problem that would have to be accounted for. And in a sense, I do wonder, and this is like what I would like to ask you, because this is the point that I don't understand. What does it like? What would the what would be a normative principle look like on this meta level? What, like if this was something that was developed and was different from what we have? This is like
like I can bring at the face of it two different normative principles. For instance, the one the Landian one would be fragmentation. Like it's good if you have fragmentation. You don't have like bureaucracy and centralized control and all that. This is a normative principle is like it's a desirable. It's desirable is actually a kind of utilitarian way of putting it. But anyway, for outsiders maybe that will do. But it's kind of for him it's like fragmentation will bring the maximal good, something like that. And for us, expansion of the world is a maximal good. Okay, we can work with that hypothesis. But then, what if there is overlap between them two? And what if the difference is underdetermined because we need some further thing to make explicit what does it mean and in what direction we want the world to expand? What exactly means to expand the world in a certain sense? Like it's more kind of, it's not that it's completely absent, because I think the formal machinery kind of brings with it a certain kind of normative assumption, but I feel it's not enough, because there is a kind of, you can have like maximal kind of organizations and a bunch of reactionary organizations at the same time. And as Dennis is putting there, bring your own normative principles. Well, you can't really then, exclude anything then.
Yeah, but I mean, can I just ask, like, why? I mean, I think that inside this debate, there is a bunch of questions we do need to answer, but there are some that I feel like we don't. Like, we were using in the text examples of like students occupying schools. Like, who the fuck is this guy's doing patchwork? Like, what are they doing? Like, who is getting together to do what? That we should evaluate. We could use it as an example. Like, they are providing a normative theory that if things were to happen, they would judge them in a certain way rather than another, right? They're not an object we need to fit inside the theory.
Peter Thiel is building stuff in the middle of the ocean to do the patchwork. So I mean,
but that what he's building in the middle of the ocean, you have any question where you would place it? Like the thing actually being built, would you like say, yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure.
I don't know. I don't know. Like I don't know. Don't really know.
Yeah, I mean, Peter Thiel.
Is this like, is he actually building, or is this something like, oh, people are
it's building. It's doing it.
With Kanye West, probably. No, with A.
Okay, we can make fun of it, but this is our
no. This is not.
No, it's not. I'm making fun of Rafael. It's a different thing we were talking.
Because I still like Kanye West. That's fine.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I still like Richard Wagner somehow.
Yeah, okay, that's great. But unfortunately, I can't put those two on the same plane. I mean, even I can admit that. But I think like my question is like, even if people are doing stuff, even if they are doing like determinate negations of current logics, I think there's this question that we haven't really developed. And we were talking about this, I think we were talking about this in class on Wednesday. Like if you take for, this is like a really, I'm working a take that I can use Sergio Ferro's analysis of the art world in the similar sense that Badiou uses Saint Paul to describe his logics. He's using a misplaced object to describe, to make more intelligible a certain process that is applied to other political objects. But like one thing that's like interesting, and it makes a lot of sense, the problem of multiple normative principles, is that like in the first move, you have Renaissance artists negating the logic of artisanal labor. Like they will do a series of procedures to situate themselves outside these certain necessities and restrictions in the market world. But they are able to do that because they can support themselves in two other logics. The logic of the state of mode B, in the sense that they play a part in the fights between lords and noble people, but they also play a sort of game in mode A, like in culture. There could be this discussion about this, but not tie myself too much to this. But what I think is interesting about the second volume that discusses Impressionist art, especially Manet and Picasso, is that he attempts to deny also the other logics. And in a sense, it seems like there's this determinate negation that does not point to a stable normative principle in land sense or in patchwork sense, because I don't think that would be something that would be available without the structure that is being negated being normalized in the first place. I don't see. I think you cannot. I don't see how you can have such a positive view in this movement, because the logic, the normative principles you are describing, they seem too restricted, even more restricted than, free association.
Free association is a normative principle.
Yes, but it's a normative principle that does not solve all the interactions between political bodies.
But this is kind of a problem because it leaves open the certain kinds of free association that might not.
But I think that's a political problem. They are not decided beforehand.
But if you are doing politics, you need to adjudicate what you're doing. You have to evaluate. Even if political practice is immanent, thinking is immanent in the political practice. So you have to evaluate and adjudicate. So this is a problem.
That's what I don't understand. Like, can we make a mental, perhaps like a thought experiment of the situation that would kind of pose the problem? I understand that, from what I understood, patchwork and this kind of right-wing accelerationist thing, like if I understood the possible objection or counterexample that he proposes that it looks at first glance as an expansionist idea, but in some kind of clear sense, it should be a bit more reactionary, so it would pose a problem. Is that it?
I'm not sure if this is the right way to put it. I think we really should wait for, a certain, a more, fair kind of assessment with the text, because, for instance, the things that we, or maybe, the liberal left would think are, emancipatory, they think are restrictive, and the things that the liberal left think are restrictive, they think are emancipatory. So it's kind of, there is kind of an inversion right there. And I think the principle of evaluation is maximal fragmentation, therefore bringing maximal difference between the organizational forms, which of course may not ever be true, but anyway, the theory is that, and some people are interested in kind of doing it somehow. But yeah, so it's just I'm not taking them super seriously. I'm just taking them like a limit example, like a limit case for free association, in a certain sense that maybe we have to put some work into.
Yeah, no, yeah, I'm not trying to. I'm trying to frame the counterexample in the way that you find it useful.
Yeah,
because, for example, I find these two different questions. Like, one question is to be like, I meet a group of guys and we're gonna, for example, we're now planning the elections, and they tell us, okay, guys, you want to go and vote and ask for votes for Lula, but what if a world where Bolsonaro is ruling, like they're Cenobites in Hellraiser? Like, what if pain is pleasure and pleasure is pain? Let's invert everything. Normatively, things have been inverted. And now what looked up looks down, and what down looks up, and what looked like reductive is actually expansive. But the challenge they're posing is, isn't this inversion legitimate? Right?
Yeah, and you think it's a nominalistic inversion? I'm not sure. Like,
no, yeah, this is one version. The other is to say something like, you're looking for certain consequences in terms of, level of integration between parts of society, expansion of possible things. Well, but this thing you're saying that it's going to take us there is not going to take us there. So
yeah,
I'm justifying. Yeah. So, but then my question would be, where do we find examples that this inversion is actually a better way of looking at consequences, or this consequence versus that will show us that this is not a nominalist inversion or an aesthetic inversion?
My concern is that we are upholding it. It's our model.
What do you mean?
My concern is that org is bigger than K is exactly that.
Why?
Like because we want different things, and for instance, I think, for instance, one of the targets of the theory is the idea, for instance, of a certain central liberal kind of thinking and organizing and stuff like that, certain kinds of universals and stuff like that they feel are restrictive because some stuff is excluded. So how you don't exclude things, you fragment, and things are valid in different social formations of certain sorts. This can be a candidate in a certain sense to free association, can't it?
I don't see. I mean, I have a hard time following that. I mean, the place where I would really like to develop this, because now that you say it, it sounds like a very good example. Like why this sounds like useful enemies, and why this new kind of deep, new reactionary thinking sounds very sophisticated, but also very contemporary, is that there is a wrong idea that fascism cannot start from multiplicity, or that reactionary thought always starts from the one.
Exactly.
Yeah, but just because you start from fragmentation, and you're right in assuming that somehow multiplicity...
That's the normative principle. That's normative. You start from the fragmentation, and then you have the normative principle that brings you either to a certain form of fascism or to free association. So
yeah, but look, again,
it's a problem of routing, kind of the.
No, but look, we can just
ecology.
Can I just slow down?
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying to bring us back to the text, right? So I find it very nice to see that we developed the thesis of peripherization, which implies that a certain homogeneity or unification of capitalist social formations is an exception, not the rule, right? Historically came from something more fragmented and historically tends towards that fragmentation, which appears in peripheral forms. We saw that there's something about the social terrain, which is fragmented, patchworky, why not, right? In that kind of situation. And then we described a sort of proof that there is an old or a thesis that there isn't a left that gets saturated, and where it thinks it's progressive, it actually looks react. Yeah, exactly. So, but every fascism is right up until that exact point. It's always correct. Like fascists always get that part right. Like they always see a misery the left is not seeing, and they're always good at saying that the left is hypocritical. That until everyone like that going that far shouldn't be that surprising, right?
But the problem is the fragmentation bit. I think this is.
But fragmentation is not a normative thing. We don't need to. That's my whole point. Fragmentation is not a normative thing. It's a social structure. So when you uphold it normatively, you're being either conservative or reactionary. It's already a given. Like nobody needs to fight for fragments competing. That's like bread and butter.
I also don't think it's fair to take fragmentation as a normative principle. Fragmentation is the result of individuals having their interests respected or not.
No, that's
I think
not
fragmentation is an effect. It's like it's a desired outcome, but it's like a predictive outcome. Yeah, no, I mean this is what I'm saying. I think that the Patchworkian and Moldbogian people, they have a normative principle, which is market exchanges themselves are the criteria for social formations. If they survive,
I think that's open for debate. Maybe you're right, but I don't think that's that's as easy to solve like that. Like, normative principles are. In other words, you're saying at the meta level there's no normative principle. It's only in.
No. I think there's a normative principle. That's why I think it's a reactionary movement. I think they take mode C as the prevailing logic, and they take specifically the individual as someone which is interested in, has interests, commercial interests, and then they just generalize this relation and negate all other types of logic. But I mean, I understand this is something we can work on a presentation that's geared towards this. But I do think this, like just what I was going to say, I think the fact that they have a clear principle, which is like, this is the preferred form of government, shows that even if you take them as a political force, I mean, by whatever normative principles, they are in a sense under.
I understand what you're saying. But then there's a kind of exegetical kind of difficulty, is that, for instance, in certain texts they say something like fragmentation is desired because then you can experiment. So there's a kind of a place for political experimentation. But in the first Moldbug text, new cameralism, right? You have like this kind of design of a certain organization where you have like a state that is organized as a company, and citizens are actually how do you say that, are associates of the company, and you don't get to vote. You just get to exit and move to another company. So this is kind of, exit is better than vote. They have like this little principle. So it's better to be able to exit anywhere than to vote. And because democracy is bad and all of that, this is the reactionary part. Democracy is bad for them. Democracy kind of, and the argument is kind of interesting, mildly interesting, in the sense that democracy kind of reduces everything to a certain kind of middle, right? So if you want actual political organization, it's better to have exit than voice, as they say. Like you get to participate freely in several political experiments, but you don't get to have a voice in the form of a vote in a democratic system, in a certain sense. And this is why they kind of exclude democratic kind of forms of organization. And this is actually actually the concretely reactionary bit. But there is this kind of overlap where there is something that is a kind of entropy, organizational entropy, whereby political experimentation is maximized. And I have a hard time differentiating, org bigger than K from that possibility.
I think that they would just end up being involuntary communism. I mean, it's like, we're going to experiment.
It's possible.
And
it's possible.
And then
yeah.
and then they would be like a flat earther. They would either like, oh, we can experiment, and then we would have to negate all these restrictions we are doing, or they would continue restricting. Then they would be just like reactionary. They would confirm the truth of
yeah, exactly. But don't you see that perhaps if their framework is open to having like an emancipatory and the reactionary form, isn't this exactly what we are doing as well? Like we have like an emancipatory form and a reactionary form in the form of a reduction, and this is up to what the organizations are doing in a certain sense.
Look, I mean, I really cannot like see it, just because we would need some like practical counterpart to make sure we're not just discussing like, how about this sci-fi concept, right? Because I mean, the part that seems the most kind of connected, and honestly, I find it, now that you're saying it, looks like a really good counterpart, really, like in the sense that we have usually a hard time finding a contemporary form of something reactionary that does what usually reactionary fascist projects do, which is they say a couple of true things and then take, a reductive answer. Because
maybe that's
they would say, yeah, fragmentation, we're seeing that. Like, I mean, it's like these guys reading Viveiros de Castro, like Dugin for reactionary purposes. Yeah, multiple worlds, fragmentation. So everyone should stay in their fucking world and not bother me anymore, right? Yeah, but there are two things there that I find very telling. The first is that and this goes back to the Modi problem. I mean, I do think that Badiou has a really good point when he says, usually fascism is a simulation of an eventual process. Like it has all the elements, but in a positive sense. That's why it's so inviting. Like everywhere where you should stay quiet and listen to something that's already going on, you get to speak out loud and propose the form it should take. So from afar, it looks indistinguishable, which is what people usually say with like this extreme right is the extreme left kind of proposals. But one of them is literally proposing positively what should, come out of the sewers of a rotten society and take its place. And the other is actually going to actually real people and seeing what they can build together. You want tools to do what people want to do, not what you want to do, right? So in that level, that's a really good reason why, again, Modi, we have a political reason not to overemphasize what structures, what institutions, what forms of connection. Like, so that's one part. And the second, which I find also very telling, is that usually a logical or a philosophical or conceptual condition for us to normatively propose something that takes this eventual novel place is that you end up taking something that is structural and turning it into a pot. Something that becomes an ought, right? It is, but it's kind of hidden, or it is, but it is regional, and then you generalize it as an ought. So it gets the impression of being a novel principle you're imposing. But if you look at it, it's already happening somewhere with terrible consequences. And I feel like this mixture of this real novelty, like it is a real novelty for most of the world, that you can get extreme fragmentation of social sphere with complete dominance of market logic. Like most places in the world are not aware, and they are hypocritical for not being aware. And this type of alt-right is correct for criticizing them for being unaware of this. This does say something very bad about that left, like about its saturation, its endogenous reproduction, right? Yeah. So up to that point, like most kind of fascist like enterprises, it touches on something real, and it is able to both posit half a truth and filling the other half with a positive normative thing, which is actually like a mixture of already existing things that are poorly distributed. For example, colonization practices of Europe in Africa, you bring them back to Europe. And you say, hey, I have a new thing here where a novel way for dealing with unwanted people, but that's an old way. It's not a new way, right? So I think perhaps it's a really, really, really good example of showing how you can have a process that lives up to the structural thesis, gives them a bit of a normative twist, and gives them a more positive outlook than we are able to give. But I feel like generally that's a bit of the task of emancipatory thinking. How can you be theoretically weak in the sense of not positing something? It feels like you lose the battle against, the Chad fascist, but who tells you like, imagine this, imagine the AI on the moon. Yeah, cool, dude. But you will, at the end of the day, be sitting in front of your computer, and this idea does not build anything with anyone, right? Whereas, so I feel like that's kind of the perhaps a way of bringing this in to highlight the similarities, But I do feel like we already have means of making a bit clearer this distinction,
Yeah, I think we should give the floor to Anna. She's
sorry,
been up for a long time. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I got so caught up in the conversation. I was trying to find a particular citation in the Tristan Garcia book, but I guess I'll just sort of talk about my impression of it. I think it's really relevant to this, both in like the insights that it offers and in the places where I think it's wrong and like where I would really disagree with it. Because it's like it's addressing a lot of the exact concerns that JP is bringing up. Like he talks about, this space where like there's no, we're in a particular moment where there's no and this is I think very, very similar to the WTPO thing. We realize there isn't actually a sort of universal or metaphysical ground for any form of a political we, and this creates this situation where it's in a sense kind of undecidable how to frame what domination is. That the concept of domination becomes or the feeling of domination kind of comes before the any kind of concept of domination that would be consistent across any different formulation of what are these different we's and what are the ones that are more important than the other ones. And then he also talks about this in terms of, and he does it in this sort of very, very like kind of, outmoded maybe way of talking about, political idealism versus realism and like expansion and reduction and all of this. But I mean, the problems that he brings up and the way that he resolves them, like he ends up with this sort of very kind of like, it almost feels a little bit Aristotle like golden mean, or maybe like if you're being a little bit more charitable, a kind of like attempt at parallax sort of middle way thing. But I mean, he's taking these different oppositions and he's constantly trying to look for, well, like what is the thing that both of them are missing, blah blah. I think that like there's a lot to be said for maybe leaning into certain oppositions as opposed one side of the opposition as opposed to the other. But the kind of critique that Garcia allows us to have is sort of what JP is bringing up, that like, to what extent is it possible that when we lean into one side of these oppositions, the one that would, in principle have more things, how can we sort of self-reflexively look back and just check ourselves and see where we're not also, taking on elements of the side that we're opposing or whatever. I mean, I was like, I sort of suggested in the chat that I might want to throw together some kind of like presentation on some of the arguments in the book or some of the key passages from the book, because I feel like it might be really good to just sort of talk through some of the things that he brings up and like to what extent they're reasonable and to what extent they're like really not, or like, we feel confident about arguing against them, because I think that also might sort of help sort through some of what some of the stuff that JP is bringing up, and like also like some of the things that Gabrielle has been saying, like to what extent do we even have to like answer these questions? Like a lot of the normative stuff, I feel like it's something that I don't know how much of it is really like something SCP is or should be doing to address, but I think it's definitely good to sort of at least kind of check ourselves and see where these problems might be entering into things that we're saying, or like ways that we're doing things a certain way that are at least worth sort of looking into and reflecting on in a different way.
We're operatic now.
No, I'm reading what everyone said, like 300 messages on the chat.
Yeah, I do think we should look into these matters more seriously. Maybe we get to the conclusion that it's all bullshit, but
I really don't think it's all. I mean, just to make sure, from my perspective, I really didn't mean it's all bullshit.
no, I'm not assigning that to you by any means. I'm just saying that I'm not sure about it, but it's something that popped into my mind, and I think it's relevant. And it's a contemporary example of alt-right new reactionary thing that might be fruitful to compare to what we are doing in a certain sense.
Yeah, I agree.
And I mean, maybe another better thing to look at too, that like, I don't know, maybe this isn't as obvious because it's not as obviously reactionary, but like I brought up in the chat about Taleb and some of the people in sort of like left blockchain circles who use some of his rhetoric or some of his ideas. Like I think the concept of anti-fragility is one that I end up also relying on a lot, and I think is something that in a way is shared between these different perspectives that JP has been talking about, where it's like, you know, if your principle is one of experimentation and you want to see what sort of succeeds when it's put to the task of experimentation to see what's universal, there are different ways of interpreting that. Like in a way, like you can say like there's sort of a reactionary position on anti-fragility, and then there's, you know, an emancipatory position on anti-fragility. And maybe this goes back to some of the more basic distinctions we were drawing with the some of the formalisms at the end of UTPO, but it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think there is a whole fertile space to pursue this more.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Barba diferente.
That maybe
Tiene muchos anillos.
there's somebody with something.
So,
Fernanda is learning
Sorry,
Spanish.
yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Should we try to just go through the?
Yeah,
I mean,
I guess we have to go through the text, right?
Yeah, it would be a good idea just to go over these two theses. I mean, I do think that this is a good kind of, it's all a good introduction to this. I just honestly, I mean, ultimately, just to clarify also, right? Why are we doing this? I think it's first so that we can find holes in the arguments or incomplete arguments we might want to expand. I mean, I wouldn't even say that's the first. I'd say that's like the second. The first objective is to make sure everyone is on the same page with what we actually managed to put down, right? So if things are not, I mean, I would say like to make sure everyone understands what we tried to do, and then to see if there's more things or other things we could do if those ideas are not good enough, or there are holes, or there are things we could expand. So just to be sure that we can kind of facilitate kind of the debates by having some basic common ground, but also because it looked like this text could be expanded to a larger things. Perhaps we could share parts of it so different people can expand it, and it could turn into like a nice a project on its own, right? This expansion. Also, just to mention, it seems like the text is coming out through Prizes and Critiquing like 10 to 15 days. So yeah, that's that. So just to, I'm not sure if this is a good summary. I'm not sure if anyone wants to try to summarize it, but I feel like we should be able at this point to give like a short kind of account of the four first theses we discussed, right? Peripherization and this idea that there are conditions for the production of this homogenization of social formations, that this conditions have to do with a certain type of exploitation or in surplus extraction, and with time it becomes clear that capital can extract surplus value while not producing that homogeneity. Not only can it do without, but most ways it can do don't require it to produce that sort of homogeneity. So there is a bit of a idea that peripherization is an expensive idea, right? The world tends towards it because this is a more general form of capitalism than a singular kind of an anomaly. Anomaly was the period where you had social welfareism and things like this. Vulgarization is a thesis that is kind of say embedding us in that space, right? And telling us that how does this space look more generally? So it tends to look like this fragmented thing where you cannot have invariances being translated from one place to another. We discussed images like a misalignment of these different layers and how these things get structured, and that you get the problem of, you know, knowing if things lack a form because they simply don't compose well with parts of this fragmented space, or if they have an alternative form, right? And we use this to go into the saturation thesis, which would be like our first political thesis, which is to say, well, if you have a language and organizational forms built within the kind of historical sequence that is kind of grounded on this alignment of different layers under the society of work kind of principle, that a lot of your ways of analyzing reality, of describing how the world works, of mobilizing people, organizing people, will kind of falter, will lose their reference, right? So saturation would imply that I think it has a nice kind of idea also that language, there is a history of the reference of a language, right? That you can lose your reference and you can gain reference, and using the same words, it's not like a eternal thing, right? There is a social historical process there. I mean, I think it opens to a bunch of interesting debates over political language and the use of words in politics and so on. So, but there is this idea of saturation, and then the fourth one, which we discussed actually quite briefly, which was the endogenous reproduction one, which is the idea that, well, the more the left loses a referent in this landscape, in the sense, not in the memory evolutive systems meaning of the word landscape, but the sense of this kind of shared environment that overlaps with social reality at large, the more we cannot name things outside of the leftist ecosystem, the more we only rely on the names that kind of circulate inside that system itself to orient. So you get this sort of endogenous feedback structure that you localize yourself with regards to negating other groups that you feel are not doing a good job and things like this, becoming kind of like a bubble kind of thing, right? So it's saturation it's also a description of, sorry, I now that I think of it, it's not a proper way of saying it, right? Because in the saturation thesis, we were also claiming that political processes that appear in this vulgar space, they might look like they have no form from the standpoint of a language that is saturated, right? And then the things that do appear to have form, which is the endogenous reproduction thesis, are parts of the left in this kind of endogenous ecosystem. Does it make sense, Rafael?
Yeah, no, I think it was really good, and it really made me think about the transition from the fourth to the fifth thesis, because in a sense it seems as if there's a false multiplicity in the endogenous reproduction, because you are abstractly doing the multiplicity that is lacking in effect. This is just like a little point, but I think it could, if we ever expand, I think this relation between a false multiplicity and a true multiplicity could be useful, because you can have like this discussion that if you are multiplying models of left, incorporating types of, oh, this left has these predicates, etc., you are really multiplying the left, when in fact it's only doing this reproduction. This is just like a further expansion if we get to this.
Yeah, I actually think that's a really good idea. Like to be more clear about that, right? That we could have. I mean, we do have that kind of as a double kind of exit, that we're not taking any of the two, right? One is to claim that, well, fragmentation is accidental thing, and the correction is to return to unity, right? Because that's the underlying form. So if we're still a capitalist society, there should be an anti-capitalist left, and that's the left that matters, right? And then there's the other one, which is well, but if there is a social fragmentation, everyone is going to organize starting from these new localities which are very heterogeneous. Then you have infinitely different forms of the left, right? And then you get like this double, either the one against the multiple or the multiple against the one. And those two seem to be like two possibilities for the left that in a certain way, it's not exactly neither of the one that we're taking, because we're taking like a finite amount of logic. Like we want to say yes, there will be many ways of people organizing. They are potentially compatible because they're not stemming from an infinite amount of singular logics. They're stemming from a finite set of logic. So it might be complicated, but not impossible to build some cooperative structures, right? So that argument seems to rely on something which is neither of the two. If there is a anti-capitalist left that is a principle that guarantees connection, then there is no reason to worry about connectivity. It should be easy to overcome complexity and connect all the left, right? Or to dismiss the parts that don't want to. And if, on the other hand, the complexity is absolutely irreducible, there is no finite set of kind of basic structures we can orient ourselves through, then you have like infinite complexity, and connectivity should be kind of thrown away, because you will ultimately be imposing the logic of one left over the others, right? And I feel like we're trying to fall in neither of those two kind of poles in a way. Yeah, definitely. I think that ultimately it's a compositional left, right? So I think that the multiplicity thesis, it could almost be defended in this way, right? I mean, it does sound very specific to claim like this infinite multiplicity of lefts, it's almost indistinguishable from the one left, because ultimately you get only one principle to do things, right? I don't think it makes sense to change multiplicity for complexity, because we have a more compositional part here, right? So I have the impression that, like, I don't know what you guys think, but for me, the basic description of the thesis 5 is just that, okay, don't assume then that there is an underlying basis. So you will, how did we put it at the end of this? Yeah, I think so. I think it's a double principle, which is very interesting. One is that there is no one essence to the left, but if there is no one essence to the left, that doesn't mean you fall on the even richer multiplicity of infinite creativity. You fall on the multiplicity of regular everyday society, right? I think that's perhaps how we avoid both poles, right? Like the left is multiple because the world is multiple. The left is not multiple because it's either below the world is capitalistic and we're multiple, so we need to return to the unity, nor the left is multiple because it's better than the world, because the world is one and we are richer by necessity, right? The world is fragmented, so that's where we should start from. We're made up of the same stuff, right? So that's the idea that political challenges of the left resonate with organizational challenges faced by people everywhere, meaning you have empirical evidence that should start from the idea that these normative principles don't necessarily match. You don't need any added thing to arrive at that multiplicity, right? And also that also means that solving problems connected to multiplicity, unity, composition, connectivity, complexity within the left is also to kind of approach already a problem that has to do with social structure in general, right? Because, I mean, it's not obvious, but this could not be the case. So let's say, imagine the world is fragmented, but there is only one left. So dealing with problems of multiplicity in the left is totally qualitatively different than dealing with problems in society, because society is multiple, the left is one. So our problems are different problems of a different quality, right? The same if the inverse, society is one, and the left is multiple and rich. So all the problems of richness and multiplicity are beyond problems of actual everyday social life. Like I feel the first way of arguing for this thesis is that, yeah, it makes things more ordinary. If we're claiming the peripherization, the vulgarization thing, we're not opting out or proposing a different direction from thesis 3 and 4 based on introducing something new. We're just proposing a solution that starts by embedding the left in thesis 1 and 2. Right? I think that's a way of framing it, perhaps.
Yeah, I think I wonder even if there's like this possible diagram that could be done for this movement, because there's in fact like these, maybe it will be more of a drawing like the one that Dennis has been doing, where you have this disembedding, and then the problem of re-embedding appears as the root to compositional, to a further composition of the left.
Yeah, it feels like a cartoon, right? Like the cartoon is running, the ground stops, and then you start running on your own. But then, like, if you keep on running while you're above the abyss, like there is no traction, right? You actually need to fall all the way down, and then there is ground again. Like, it feels like it's more like that. Like that's, I think, why we formulated first as a negative thing, right? To drop a belief. The sense that you shouldn't assume that there is this ground that is different from the ground that peripherization and vulgarization imply. And once you drop this belief, some problems, political challenges, become more similar to the organizational challenges and the rest of social structure. And political solutions also become closer to structural problems outside of the political sphere, right? So that connection becomes clearer because you've embedded your presuppositions or your beliefs about where you're starting from in the kind of more peripheral point of view.
Would this be a place to? I don't remember if this is actually in the essay. I mean, I've read it over so many times, but would this be a place to point the entailment structure that Rosen develops as a model of this?
But why is it? What do you mean?
I mean, I was thinking the entailment structure. I mean that like logical entailments that Rosen develops.
The modeling thing, right?
Yeah. If this would be because it seems to like the composition. There's like the multiplicity of the left, and the solution is not going like from one left to the other as a composition. You have to go to a social terrain, and then there's an re-embedding of the left, of one left in a social terrain. And the problem of composing the left is the problem of dealing with these different social terrains. But maybe that's just like something that would be too far off.
Yeah, I have the impression that Rosen is just trying to unfold what he sees as the basic for anything to function as a model for something else. And I think that's kind of implied in this idea that, well, if you make the stuff of the left's ecosystem be more like the stuff of every other part of society, then you have better grounds to say that solutions or logics that appear inside one of these poles is applicable to the other because they are homogeneous in some level, right? Like it's a weird idea that by treating ourselves as more heterogeneous, we become more homogeneous with something else which is heterogeneous, right? With something in that sense. So I think the analogy goes that far. Like if we want to say more than that, I think we need more material. Yeah, I just wouldn't add it here because there is no, I mean, imagine stopping this political analysis to say there is a theoretical biologist who discussing modeling relations.
No, I don't. Yeah, we don't have to add Rosen in it. But I was just thinking that I think there's a lack of pictures in the first part of the essay. I was thinking about
lack of pictures.
Yeah.
Lack
No,
of
but
pictures.
because what?
Oh, I'm impressed. I'm impressed. Lack of pictures. That's a good point, I think.
Yeah, it's because I do think that like there's this very I mean, I think there could be the STP picture book, children's picture book. I mean, communist
we should-
STP for children, just like Lyotard did postmodernist for children. But I was
We
just thinking
We
because
should make it into a fanzine then, and publish it as a zine with lots of pictures and stuff like that.
no, I agree, but it was just like I don't think we have to mention Rosen. I mean, just the structure of embedding and re-embedding. But maybe I think I'm also too. I'm really loving Dennis's recent pictures and style. So maybe that's a plea for more illustrations.
No, I mean, yeah, Renzo, sorry.
No, I have more of a question. I have to leave soon, but I think it's more related. I'm not sure where it fits my sort of, because it's in some sense I'm not sure where the whole thing of what was it called, organizational maximalism, when it was first, in what context it appeared. So if I understood well, like this, the political multiplicity is more about a new way, like a proposition about a new way of which politics relate to the social, right? It's sort of like it both functions as a model of the social, like a local model of something, so it reobtains a relation to the sort of like social reality, and it's also a claim about the multiplicity of this fragmentation, social logic, and that politics should in some sense mimic that. And then the next thesis is more related to the sort of like org of both the point of view of like that goes towards Trinitarianism, but also, if I remember well, of in some sense to the whole org is bigger. But my question is, where does this idea of the maximalism would fit into, if by maximalism I seem to understand like some sort of like strategic is a bit stronger or more concrete than the org, the communist hypothesis thing, because communist hypothesis is more of a existential claim, like a postulate to me, while maximalism seems to be can potentially function as a sort of like orientation principle or strategic principle. But at that point, well, my question is like, it seems to have both like a weak and stronger version of I'm trying to think how, like, I often think how that could work in practice, like, because there seems to be also like a more weaker version or a more global version, which we're trying to say that we're trying to, make more things possible, which is in line. Like a better word is a bigger world. So we're trying to make more things sort of like possible through association. And then there's another like sort of like take, which is more local or more like stronger, which is actually trying to implement in like local struggles some sort of like maximalist political strategy, which is not normally hard for me to actually like. So if that's the case, like, so my question is like, if this is the right way to understand, because I don't remember where it came from, this whole idea of maximalism, but I am not sure where it would fit within these two theses, these two last theses, because I think it's probably related to them.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the places that I know of this, I for example, personally, I never use this term because I see it being an argument made in the philosophy of mathematics over why choosing the axiom of infinity and axiom of choice over other things. It's like, but you only mentions this to say, yeah, I prefer, choosing a understanding of mathematics that accepts more mathematical structures rather than less. That's the argument. He never uses it as a political category. I think Reza Naderi used it like one or two times in his section in the atlas, but I don't see where we use it. Like, I don't think it's honestly like the best way to define anything we've been doing. I feel like it became synonymous with something that is actually much more specific, which is the idea of supplementing a situation with, you know, a subset that is common to that situation. So expanding a world by adding common parts to it, which is like the generic process, which is much more the core of stuff we build on top of, right? I feel like there is a difference between posing that there is some, I mean, honestly, Anna, I mean, even if Badiou did say that, I don't like, fine by him, for him, like I haven't seen us using it. I don't know how to use it. It just seems to suggest like a top-down approach where you created this idea that maximalism is a principle, where it was just an argument for selecting a set of axioms over another in mathematics. But if you turn it to a general principle, it just looks like you should expand for the sake of expanding. But then there's the bottom-up approach, which I think it's more interesting, and I think it's much more connected to what we've been doing, which I wouldn't call it maximalism, but it's the generic approach, which is, it is generally good. It is the definition of the good, why not, for Platonists even, that you take common parts of situations and add them to those situations, right? And that by formal principles, this is usually not included in the situation itself. But you don't add common generic subsets simply by fragmenting, breaking apart, and doing whatever. Like, it's that mixture of exception and commonality, right? So you need to build something. You can't just, so I don't know where to put the maximalism thing, especially because maximalism seems to imply more like a prudent idea, like, well, if you present me with two versions, both of them don't really speak for themselves. Like, they're kind of neutral between the two. I can't really separate the two. Well, this will be a criteria I will use. I rather choose a proof that uses the principle of non-contradiction and this and that, because it will give me more mathematical structures than if I suspend the principle of non-contradiction for good, right? I think that's as far as the maximalism goes. But then the generic, it gives the cooler part, which is, yes, I want to expand situations based on their common parts. There is no general principle for doing that. You need actually to go into the situation and find the normative principles inside of it to do it, right? So there is no political principle, which is just take the common part of every situation, because the common part of every situation is something you only know by being there and engaging with stuff, right? So from the bottom up, it looks a bit more kind of connected to what we were doing here, I think. Whereas from the top down, it would look a bit extraneous, like coming from nowhere. We would need a seventh thesis that claims, in this context of this and this situation, striving for more organizational forms is always a good thing. And I don't think we need to commit to that, right? Even though there might be a political movement that gets interesting things done by being committed to that. I don't know. Like, I feel like the ambivalence that Caron was mentioning is still in place to discuss. But the very fact we wouldn't add a seventh principle saying we're committed to more rather than less, like.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful too, between the concrete operations in which you construct stuff it's more related to the generic procedure than necessarily implementing some sort of like local maximization of stuff within. But I mean, there's still, and I don't know how Badiou does that, but the connection between the generic procedure, which is a local sort of like dealing with the situation, and ultimately this having a consequence for the sort of cardinality of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what's the link between generic procedure and the cardinality of a system?
Yeah, it's total. Like, this is the cool thing. Like, this is also why I think these two principles are, if you take the two as principles, like one claiming maximalism being the top bottom normative principle that more is better, and generic being the bottom up principle that you should, like, truth is what is common. Therefore, you should, if you are interested in the truth, you should be interested in what is common, right? There is, if you take the two as normative principles, the first normative principle won't really allow you to distinguish between infinite amount of stuff, because, for example, a capitalist world, I mean, every social logic we've been talking about is potentially infinite and can account for everything everywhere, right? You can write a sci-fi where, I mean, it has already been written, is the Cixin Liu guy, the three-body problem. It's pretty much mode A in space, where everyone is hidden in the dark forest because if they meet, they'll have to eat each other out. Like, you know, it's already done. So like you can get like space mode A, space mode B, which is like Star Wars, right? And you can get like space mode C is, I mean, classic stuff. So you can get infinite in this sense, but you can still be inside the same cardinality while being infinite. Whereas the expansion, I feel like the expansion in generic, it can, as like when we were talking about communist hypothesis, the day that Caron presented on it and this org versus K thing. For example, you can have one piece of atonal music, like a small cluster of pieces, and that's already an expansion of the world, even though if you count the amount of pieces, it's less pieces than the amount of tonal pieces in the world. Whereas you can say, well, but what if I have a computer that plays out all possible combinations of music? Well, it will have played more pieces of music than the small amount of pieces composed by, you know, serialist composers in Europe in a certain period. It's infinitely more, but it's smaller, the world.
Yeah, I think
that's a difference between maximalism in that normative principle and the generic principle. I think it's a really good distinction. Like, there is a perfect poem from Victor Hugo about this. Have you seen this one where it's a discussion between a little river and the sea, and like the sea is like French people, right? Like the sea is like saying, "Who the fuck are you, little river? Like, I have like all drops of water in the world. I'm bigger than the horizon. I'm like a huge infinity and so on. What do you have that I don't have?" And then the river says, like, "I have a drop of water you can drink." And then it's like Lacriani, total. You know, like it's that kind of twist. Like, I have one thing that you don't have, even though I'm clearly smaller than you. Like, it's a really good intuition of how expanding the world doesn't need to mean that you're countably larger. You can, that's the cool thing about infinity, right? It really does give a sense that you can expand something in a very counterintuitive way, I think.
Yeah, but I feel this is a very important distinction between it's easy to mix them in the sense that we use both, and like this maximality idea, it's pretty deep when taken as a sort of global proposition. But if you present it as a sort of local procedure, it sounds very like particular, and like, sure, you can always try that, but why would you have to? And the opposite is also true. Like this generic procedure seems a very deep thing as a sort of like a concrete operation, but it doesn't tell much in terms of as a global principle. So I think distinguishing these two things is
yeah, but I really think we're better off understanding what we're doing, trying to find larger structures that build from generic towards something larger. So like from the body to an ecology, I think that's pretty much where we are right now. And then we have the problem of how to ecologies go to economies, rather than the inverse, which is like this general universal cosmological principle of pure expansion for the sake of expansion. But, you know, like expansion of the universe can be pretty boring in the sense that, I mean, I think if you were a god right now, you probably exchange gladly looking at 100 billion stars being born the same way and seeing a couple of people, you know, having some drama here on the street. Like it's a bit different at least. So like the concept of what is a sizable novelty can be very effective when you add like infinity to the arguments. It's very refreshing.
Yeah, and I think that in this sense, the communist hypothesis proposition is good in the sense that it's the minimal thing you have to say in order to like talk address in some sense this problem of the infinities without saying too much or like making it become too like too relevant for what you actually do. So I think it's I agree that the balance is on the side of the generic.
Yeah, and I mean, I like to think that this fifth thesis. Sorry, Dennis, I'll just send you the word. Like I like to think that this fifth thesis is something like saying that the situation of the left is the situation we've described with thesis 1 and 2. So it's just saying like if you want to start from somewhere, start from a situation that has peripherization and vulgarization as your as kind of structural principles, right? And thesis 2.6 is just saying when you are in that situation that's fragmented in that way, you benefit from the fact that there is a standpoint in which 3 separate layers become all kind of connected, right? There is no reason to kind of separate from the beginning infra-political, political, and metapolitical. So social life, political life, and the composition of politics, political processes, they all become readable as the same sort of thing. So that's like setting up the stakes of a reading, not like normatively describing where to go, let's say. Still need to go to the same place, yes. Sorry, then.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take some responsibility for making that maximalism thing circulate in the group because I drew that picture. And now I agree with what you're saying that it's as a normative principle, it's really kind of bad. I think it leads to all sorts of confusions there. But I think that you kind of get the same effect anyway by affirming the generic because you basically increase complexity, right? Like by affirming the generic, you're also affirming for more complex social forms to appear. Like that is kind of a condition. So it shouldn't be the, I don't know, like guiding thing, but it's kind of a nice side effect of the generic.
Yeah, but don't you think also there is, I think this is also a good kind of point that there is a difference between complexity and social complexity, right? For example, capitalism is ridiculously complex when it comes to the amount of gadgets, the amount of people, the amount of buildings, the amount of many things, right? But socially, the amount of principles you need to keep in order to navigate all of this, it's actually quite less complex, right? Actually, if you compare like certain societies where you can kind of behave like a worker, consumer, citizen, you tend to have actually even simpler kind of set of normative principles. If you follow those, I mean, have you guys noticed like how Swedish people seem, they're not exhausted, you know, like don't need to keep as many variables in your head to exist. So it's probably very soothing, you know, whereas when you need like all these different principles to navigate all these different situations, it's socially more complex, even if the amount of things so I think social complexity needs to be also kind of more specifically defined, not to mean simply complexity of information in general, complexity of, you know, the amount of stuff that is going on in the planet. Like you can imagine, and I think that that's also something special about the approaches we've been taking to complexity by using category theory rather than other approaches, right? Because we've been looking for, as we were saying when we were presenting then is on MES, we were looking at something like a qualitative concept of complexity rather than a purely kind of quantitative one, right? Like it's complex relative to a certain situation, into certain context, not just pure complexity, right? And generic is very much like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the complexity should be thought of qualitatively as like the obstacle to reducibility. So yes, there's lots of commodities, there's lots of crazy structures that are created by capitalism, but because you can reduce them to the accounting sheet, right? The credit and debt, for example, or you can reduce it to wages and profit, then you actually don't have a lot of complexity there. But yeah, it's not a lot has to be baked in to that definition to make it useful. So in that sense, the generic is already has that baked in. So maybe more useful.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I have the impression that you know, this is the sort of argument that makes, for example, space travel less complex or less expensive than creating a bunch of cooperatives in India. You know, like from a bunch of very specific points of view, the amount of computation, the amount of energy, the amount of bunch of stuff that is used, you know, in a newly integrated quantum computing kind of way to take people to Mars, it's much bigger than what it takes probably to like reorganize the economic sector in India. But the type of process that it needs so that a world is built with people actually managing resources and their time in a large country in a way that was never done before, we need a measure in which that's more complex, that's richer, right? Than the example of it's man, I'm not reading sci-fi books, I'm just watching YouTube videos about them. So I've watched a guy explaining these 3 books by this Chinese sci-fi author who is like very, very famous now. Probably shouldn't say much about it since I haven't read it, I just watched videos. But yeah, there is this argument. That's how they solve the Fermi paradox of why we haven't seen alien life. Which is that everyone knows that once alien life is, every civilization knows that once another civilization appears with enough power to let itself be known to the universe, that it's a threat. And finding out if it's a threat or not is just too menacing, like too dangerous. So once the civilization makes itself known, it's usually destroyed by another. And every civilization is just kind of hidden from one another. Right. So, which is a very mode A, like everyone is in a forest, unaware if the other is, you know, shares basic agreement in form of life or not, if you're going to be destroyed by the other. And but you know, like I think this issue of distinguishing Elon Muskiness going, let's just go to yeah, the problem of the 3 bodies. I think it's a trilogy. So I think like this is generally also the problem with Badiou, right? Badiou is all too happy that the generic is a different measure of novelty than quantitative complexity, that he doesn't really account for why, or doesn't even bother with the problem of, okay, I don't care that singular things are universal in this immediate way. I want to know how to connect all these things together. And he doesn't address that at all, right? Which is a problem that brings us back closer to like integrating in a complex way, fragments and so on. So, but like, I'm not sure what you guys think of this. I just want to make sure we cover it. Like, I feel like the way we wrote this, the multiplicity thesis is like a embedding thesis, right? You're letting go of this principle of common essence, not because we know what its essence is, but which is something else, but just so we actually get to embed it in the peripheric situation. These are consequences of embedding it in a situation that is fragmented and so on. And this is, let's say, a more unfolded way of talking about those consequences, right? That now, not only generally will your problems can your problems now be treated in a way that's similar to the way you would describe social problems at large, and then if you manage to solve something, there should be some transitivity recuperated, some reference with the rest of the world, but also that there is some distinction that is now not clear, because the process of homogenizing the left, homogenizing organizations or things like this, that you could expect the world to do for you, you cannot expect that anymore, right? So you not to assume that there is a necessary social tendency that do by itself produce a common basis for the multitude of political forces, right? And then I think thesis 6 is the only one that is a bit more. I mean, the fifth one is like a proposition, like a prescriptive one, but still negative, like drop a belief, which comes with certain consequences. The sixth one is one that is a bit more prescriptive than that, which is saying, well, under these conditions, right, it's saying that the best way to avoid treating novel social and political forces as formless eruptions or unthinkable potentialities, develop a theoretical grammar that can remain continuous while thematizing radically discontinuous forms. So you need to thematize continuity and discontinuity between modernizing and peripheral social forms. So we need to be able to account for aligned and non-aligned kind of social constructions, right? Tell apart, let's say, what is a popular space that has this kind of alignment and homogeneity from one that doesn't. We must be able to both describe, let's say, a leftist ecosystem that is now saturated, but account for how something like that could be built, but also talk about new political forms as having themselves some sort of consistency of their own, in a way that we account for leftist fragmentation and how the world's fragmentation has to do with the fragmentation inside the leftist ecosystem, right? They did it. We needed a theoretical grammar that can treat this continuously, but accept that there's some discontinuity. And I don't remember what's the exact formulation that we give of this principle. Yeah, I think this is the paragraph, right? That we kind of redouble inside the leftist. So we embed the thesis 5 embeds the left into the social space. Thesis 6 kind of now mirrors the problem outside of the left, inside of the left, right? So yeah, the outside of the left, you have this vulgarization, fragmentation, lack of homogeneity. Well, how do you call this set of leftist groups, organizations tied together in a certain environment that's fragmented, blah, 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 blah. Now that you've embedded it, we call it a political ecology. And once you've embedded it and recognize a similar problem, right, you get this flattening that we talked about here at the end. That this concept is a possible answer from the organizational standpoint to the impasse of endogenous reproduction and the general principle of political multiplicity, since we are using the same tools to think different political forms and to think different ways they might interact with each other, it becomes easier to mix together first and second order political tasks, anticipating questions about effects of certain tactical choices on the ecology of organization. In other words, the organizational standpoint flattens both the infrapolitical and the political, because we treat social life as being organized. So a vulgarized social space is still formed, it's not like a deformed or amorphous space. And we also treat the political and the metapolitical as also flattened in the sense that we organize inside an organization, and mixing organizations together is itself an organizational problem, right? So not sure what's a good way of describing this like succinctly, but it looks like, right, it's like you have a kind of, we first claim that shit, Rafael's cat peed on his bed. You first have like a fragmented space, then you like with thesis 2 and 3 we remove a certain vision of the left, then we add the left here, which is thesis 5, and then we claim that its internal problem, right, looks so that there is some position, let me leave it, that there is some standpoint, which would be the organizational standpoint, that sees that it can account for this, which is organizational problems of social life, can account for this, which is organizational problems of a leftist organization in this world. It can account for this as a set, right, as a composition, which is the same point of view that accounts for how organizations compose together, right? So there is one standpoint from which we can talk about social organization, can talk about political organization, and we can talk about the composition of political organizations, right? So I feel like that's the core of this last thesis, that when you
like, if you try to commute the triangle, does it make sense? Like you drew two arrows.
So these two, and then add the one at the bottom, right? Like this.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, actually, then I would do something slightly different, right? Like if we were to do something nice like that, I would just do something like this, where then you have one position here, which is, let's say, the social world. You have a position here, which are an organization. And well, when you compose all these organizations together, right, you get like what we call an ecology. And then you could have a composition, because it looks like our diagram, which is an organization belongs to an ecology by solving some problems.
Right, yeah.
Right, and this ecology is acting on problems of the world. Well, but an organization belonging to the ecology, which is solving problems in the world, is in a way of this organization actually solving problems of the world. Then I think it commutes. And it's just, let's say, this is a way of framing exactly the problem we are trying to get at the end of this of the paper, right? This is the triangle we just wrote, and then, okay, we still need to account for this and this and this and so on, right?
Yeah, I was reading today Olivia Scaramello's stuff, and I think you sent it a long time ago, and now this is what she calls a bridging object, no? The ecology.
Yeah. Morito.
Equivalence.
Yeah, I think it has some vague connection. Yes, but I feel like this is kind of the steps. Like if we were doing like when Rafael and Dennis do the children's book, we can have like this is a social formation, and then thesis 1 is claiming that you get to have like it's almost like capital moves in it, while the thing in itself can be like broken. Doesn't require this thing to be homogeneous, right? So this is thesis 1 and 2. Then thesis 3 says that there is a left, which is kind of tries to think of a world that doesn't have this structure and tries to act based on this, and then misses out on things. That when this happens, this left tends to kind of create almost like a parody of this process and like base itself on its own internal endogenous fights or establishment. Then we're saying that, well, but we could start from a different left that sees itself as part of this world, rather than being organized in the saturated way, right? In such a way that, actually, let me just draw this separately here, right? This is a left that is also multiple, in such a way that if you, let's say, dealing with this is kind of like dealing with this here as well, right? So there is a similarity, and the logic of dealing with social fragmentation, political fragmentation, and is already the thing that connects the two, right? So you get this flattening we were talking about, like creating an organization, composing it in the leftist ecosystem, and social problems in the world at large, they're all kind of connected. Yeah, probably there's a nicer way of drawing this, but you get the, like, this would be the summary for me of the 6 theses, like it, and I feel like it stops much, again, like to go back to your question about maximality, normativity, and so on, it seems like it stops much earlier, right, than like even needing to propose some normative principle for political action, right? I find it nice that the actual formulation we did is of the multiplicity principle, actually, not even of thesis 6, it's thesis 5, which is saying that the need to frame our political theory in such a way that we never assume that there is some necessary social tendency that will by itself produce a common basis for the multitude of political forces, each operating within divergent social landscapes. It's different than claiming there is no spontaneous political action. It might very well be, right? What we're saying that there is no it's like there is no meta-teleology, like things might individuate, but they won't collectivize on their own. Like, so you might have like a bunch of political processes popping up. It's not like claiming unless we provide some interesting idea, there will be no politics. No, there's politics everywhere, right? That politics might compose together. That's the thing that we're saying that's not going to happen on its own. So it's slightly different, I think. It's also a very nice way of saving a bit of this discussion about politics is rare, politics is common. Like, consider there's a bunch of political processes going on, but the larger definition of politics we're giving later on in the text, that it's not only an exceptional mediation, but it's an exceptional mediation that also connects to a political movement of other mediations, right? The second clause is the one that takes an extra thing to happen that you couldn't count on happening on its own, right?
Yeah, I also realized that we seem to make a move from saying politics is rare in the sense that of reading like events literally, like it's not that there aren't like eventful politics happening. There's almost like a dispersive quantity of like politics everywhere. It's more the political composition which seems exceptional.
Yeah. I think that that's also a really nice aspect that are kind of more scale-based reading of some more common themes in political thinking does, is that you don't need to make that choice between is there political stuff happening or not. You don't need to make it an absolute question. Like, of course, there's a bunch of stuff, but probably depending on what you find to be relevant, it's so punctual that it's unconnected, that it's both happening a lot and not happening at all. Like, you can have both in a way, you know, like you don't need to choose. It becomes a bit of a false question, I think. Which
like,
honestly, that's how I find Badiou's point as well. Like he always has the tendency of saying like eventual processes are very, very, very common. What's uncommon is that you actually get to stitch them together with other things. Like I think that's much more his position.
yeah, a good way I think also to think is like how close or like what kind of structure you have to be part of, or like how close you have to be to actually feel or be connected to something is happening. So there is like struggles happening like in many places in Brazil, say by indigenous people. It's not as easy to sort of like relate that to where you are if you're not like literally take a flight and go there and like help organize there. So what's missing is not the fact that there is like political conflict, is that there is everything seems far away in a sense. So it's a more like spatial and compositional.
You know, like I've been thinking, I think it's a really good point, man. And I have the impression that like no one, I mean, I think that's why when Caron was talking about the accelerationist, I think that it reminded me of this book, because in a certain way, this is a good example of, you know, things can be so fragmented, even though capital still works as a dominant social form. The life worlds of people can be so fragmented that it almost seems like it's a good idea to call it many worlds. And then, even though you can partially have access to it, there's absolutely nothing in common, right? So it's just so far-fetched that that's why in the book it has that idea of like, these worlds are part of a kind of cosmological system of, you know, civilizations, but their interrelation is the atomization of these parts. Like, don't mess with one another. And I feel like what we're claiming is that it does take some weird second order work to make sure that first you have some hypotheses about how these differences are structured, so that you don't treat them as absolutes, because there is something circulating still amongst all of them, in such a way that you can then try to stitch them together and treat what look like worlds apart as regions of a one world. Like, it takes some extra stuff to see that, you know, you need to actually build that point of view, I think.
So something I was just thinking about this is like I mean, I know this is an explicit reference for Nunes, and it's, you know, something very similar is happening with Bogdanov and the organizational point of view and everything. But you know, some of the more interesting stuff that's been done in developing VSM recently in Beer's framework by people like John Walker and Angela Espinosa, they have this great book, A Complexity Approach to Sustainability. And I was just thinking about how like maybe this is another sort of point to note where there's, in a sense, like there's like politics everywhere, but like there's so little you know, actual compositional development of it, is like in the whole sustainability movement. It's maybe an interesting case study of like, you know, people trying to find a way to connect all of these super disparate things that need to be connected in this sort of very urgent sense, like everywhere. But, you know, what is it that is disrupting that, and what is it that's actually happening there, where it's like this process of attempting to compose it, you know, and how like even in this, like, is it capitalism that's doing it, or is it like, you know, this other set of processes that don't necessarily require like reference to, you know, one or another way of looking at it, that or maybe our approach helps with to some extent. Something else I was going to add to that, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm so scattered tonight, but there was something about that, maybe I'll remember it, but I just wanted to jump in with the sustainability thing, because I feel like it's relevant. So maybe looking at like places where org is, I just remembered. So Karatani and the associationism in Japan. I was looking into some of the recent works on that. There's this interesting group called, in the Japanese, I think it's Tsukaiste Jidai o Kangaeru Kai. It's like the Society for the Thinking of the Disposable Era or whatever. That some people who are worked with Karatani on the new associationist movement have been trying to develop this whole complex political infrastructure in Japan for largely addressing sustainability problems. But it's sort of connected to the associationism idea. There's this guy Yoshinaga who just wrote this book that just came out last year about sort of connecting that to some of the stuff that Karatani was doing in associationism. So I think there are all of these really interesting places maybe to look about, you know, how these attempts at compositionality could be really helpful case studies for talking about, like, you know, people are having all these great ideas all over the place, but why are they happening, or why aren't they happening?
I didn't know that there were like, I mean, I thought that the people associated with NAM had kind of stopped working on it around 2010. I didn't know there were like more recent developments. They're really cool.
Yeah, it's crazy because I mean the NAM, like it did dissolve, but you know, the movement itself sort of kept going. I mean, and some of the details, like my Japanese isn't really good enough yet to really get super deep into it, but from what I've been able to gather, it seems like it's just really transformed into something somewhat different. And just seeing that whole process develop, like that's one thing I would really like to do more research into generally, and I think would be a great thing to work on for STP too.
Do you know if Karatani is involved in it, or is it just?
I'm not sure. I ordered Yoshinaga's book, so I'm gonna, that will hopefully give me more information about like the extent to which Karatani might still be involved in it. I haven't found any direct information on that. There might be some stuff about it on his blog, which I was sort of going through, but it seems like Yoshinaga is like the main guy who's been sort of leading it. I think Karatani to a large extent, I remember with the dissolution of NAM, he was sort of like feeling like, oh, I'm a philosopher and like I'm not suited to leading this stuff and I don't want to be too involved. So I don't know if he's still really active in it, but it seems like it's really a direct response to a lot of the ideas that he was promoting with NAM.
Yeah, it makes me think that even, I mean, we were talking about composition between political movements, but even just like a single political movement is like a compositional object, right? It's like composed of individuals, and then it can kind of have a lifespan. It dies, but then another co-limit can arise later for the same individuals. So in that sense, like the evolutive systems thing kind of unifies the composition of political groups, but also just individuals creating a single group.
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time? Because I just got the notification on my phone of Raphael sending that.
Yes, yeah, I also got it at the same time.
Is this cat okay?
Yeah,
no, it's not.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I was saying that a single political organization is the outcome of composing multiple people together, right? And then we're kind of entering the scene saying that, okay, now let's compose different political groups. So we're at the like n=2 level, right? But then there's also the n=1, which is individuals composing. So evolutive systems is a nice way to kind of unify those two things, right? And we're also doing that as well when we talk about individuals, you know, enhancing their sensibility through social mediation.
Yeah, I think that's
composition at every level, right?
Yeah, I really think that the way you pose it now, I mean, I think it goes straight to the heart of the reason why I feel like there is sometimes we're going a bit too quick. Like, where's the normative principle? Like, because where did we get at the end of the 60s? Pretty much, honestly, like if I were to summarize them to people in the know, I would just claim that, you know, the thing Bogdanov used to say, like 1910, that capitalism had a tendency to produce such division of labor that if you take seriously the idea that people's life worlds are kind of dependent on how their laboring conditions go, there is such heterogeneous conditions of laboring in the world, that there is no one concept of labor that can unify those experiences. People will just go have very heterogeneous experiences, and you need something that still can kind of give you the common ground for all those different life worlds. And he says, well, that's the organizational point of view, right? And he claimed that this organizational point of view gives you the common ground for very different heterogeneous social experiences, at the same time that it's also, let's say, tuned in to what's, let's say, the cutting edge of science being done today, which is something that seems like a relevant. I mean, he went to the point of saying that, well, technology is the only reason why technology is not mathematics is as the science of forms of organization, that we need to see what's in common amongst the different forms of labor. It's because mathematics for him was too caught up in numbers, which is no longer the case. All that we did with the 6 theses is claim, well, there is a historical situation that is generalizing that pretty much poses that problem, right? You don't need to pose it because you're a kind of Bolshevik lunatic. You can actually pose it because you need to. But that's kind of where we arrive. Like organizational point of view is not a normative principle in the sense that it will tell you what to do. It just tells you that it's better to pose and answer questions in that language, given the social conditions, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like that's kind of always what I was aiming at, just in the sense of like, when you're talking about the sort of like trying to find logic similar to mode D or whatever, like, the way I was initially thinking of it is almost kind of along those lines of antifragility, of like, what is the formal structure of some kind that would be most capable of dealing with things that are alien to it or that are hostile to it or whatever. Like, what are the things that, what are the structures that would maybe, and not necessarily across every situation, but given a certain composition of situations, like, I mean, it's basically just organizational point of view. But part of the reason I was looking at the A+C spot in the multi-layered social worlds is also just because I was thinking about this question of like, and this is another thing that I think would be good to follow up on in talking about how we make use of Badiou and how we make use of the way that the sort of logical triplicity thing in conjunction with the with the multi-layered social worlds thing is, the way that classical logic has been associated with mode B, right? And I feel like that's one of those things where it's like, on the one hand, like you can get so many more mathematical structures, and you can say the same thing about how like we wouldn't really even have writing or like history or like any of that if not for mode B. But at the same time, there's this question about like, are we using, how are we taking Karatani's arguments about, mode D is opposite mode B? How are we taking like what we should, adopt from mode B, which is like what he argues is like the imperial principle or whatever. And how does that sort of square with like different ways of using mathematical orientations? Like, are we associating classical logic with mode B, and like what sense, I guess, is maybe another side of this sort of question of like how the normative principle and how the logic things overlap. Because like, I agree that it's like, we don't necessarily need any kind of stated normative principle. Like, it's something that comes through practice and that is sort of detected on like a second level thing within an organizational structure, right? But it's also kind of like, the goal is sort of to say, well, yeah, there are certain organizational structures that are more capable of of dealing with these things. And then when you find the regularities there, right, that's when you start to be able to reason about normative problems, right? So I guess that's one of the things
like, for example, why would you, I mean, I think this is important. Like, Karatani is pretty much kind of an anarchist. He has a very clear partisan take on what we should do, right? Like, he's definitely not treating mode D as the logic of many multiple leftist projects. He's actually treating it the logic of the true socialist path. Like, I don't think Karatani thinks political parties, insofar as they are very much like mixed with mode B are very interesting, right? He constructed in such a way that mode A's connection to mode D is privileged, so that, I mean, and that there is a direct opposition between mode B and mode D, but
So
he,
I mean,
he
I get,
claims that, like, do we want to
guess-
assume we know that?
well, right. So I guess here, like, you know, you could argue then that I mean, where I agree with him on this is to the extent that I think that one thing that we should strive for in political organizations is, instead of thinking like, you know, well, actually, this is interesting because I just realized like what I was about to say is sort of like, okay, well, we want to prefigure, right? Like we want to have, like, if there's a particular organizational form that we think is especially capable of dealing with the problems we want to deal with, we want to, you know, adopt that form instead of saying we're going to do whatever it takes to get to that form. I mean, on the one hand, it's like, you know, how do we know that we have that form? Right. And on the other hand, it's like, you know, why is it that that form isn't what's happening right now? Right. Like, I feel like there's this sort of double question there. To some extent, I think that, like, I am very sympathetic with his general argument, but I see what you're saying, where it's like he's assuming certain things. He's going in with a very particular kind of like
Yeah, and you know
political
what's
stance.
the hardest part is that I personally tend to agree with him. Like, I had my share of party politics in Brazil. I'm very distrustful of it today. But I mean, why should I be right? Like, should I really want to bake my opinion into the process? You know, like, and I think both questions are a bit dubious. Like, and I don't know, there's just some weird. I just feel like there's something we want to pursue in this line of questioning that I don't think we're done with, which has to do with, okay, you know, when Karatani proposed mode D, he solved a bunch of problems, and these problems are very important problems. We have to do with what about the history of this thinking? Where is it, right? There are a bunch of socialist processes until today. They're not just, let's say, pure negation. So how do we kind of, where are we going to deposit the accumulation of experiments, ideas, names, examples we have, right? I would say, and I think that's a good reason why I wouldn't put it as a transcendental for a social logic, is that it's not stored in the way we live in socially. Like, it's stored in people's heads, examples, books, right? I mean, it's curious that Karatani doesn't really need mode D to describe how social logic functions. And if you remove mode B, there is no commodity anymore, because commodity logic requires property logic, and there is no commodity, there is no communities that are exchanging at their borders. So you need communities, you need properties, and you need mode C. But do you need mode D to explain commodity logic?
Technically, so I mean, what I think, what I would say on that is that to some extent you do need it to explain the concept of the imperial principle, which then sort of ends up becoming like central to all of the ideologies of you know, from some sort of a certain midpoint in the world empires on all the way up onto the capitalist world systems, right? Where he's talking about basically like the way that the world empires adopted different universal religions came out of the process of mode D first developing in opposition to them, right? That was one of the key parts of his historical account, is that, you know, to a large extent the ideological forms of like commonality or even generosity, you could argue, that were sort of adopted by and this is why he argues this was something that should be retained from mode B, that were adopted by these sort of imperial powers or just state powers. You know, this was adopted sort of from these ideas of universalism that had already been developed, not because they were just for the purposes of the state, but because they were part of a particular kind of mode D structure that ended up having a significant historical impact, right?
Yeah, but you see, like, it's always in between modes, in between social formations, right? Like, it's never principle of logic of social consistency. It's always like you have a formation, then ethical prophets appear to criticize that formation, but their critique becomes something else other than what they are when the church appears. But then the church has no role in his description of imperial formations in terms of economical maintenance of things in a way that actually concerns mode D, it concerns mode A. So it's like interruptions, like it helps to explain the interruptions, as I think some people were saying that they, I think
Right.
Rafael,
No, I agree with that. I think that's like, you know, you could say that's a feature, not a bug, but like it implies certain things about why it's different, you know.
yeah, but then you would again say like, okay, so mode D serves as a way to explain the passage between things that have no mode D consistency, and that doesn't sound like exactly the thing we're trying to explain, right? So I have the impression that there are many interesting questions, but framing them as like, okay, what is the logic? What is the kind of toolkit, like the general toolkit of cybernetic categorical tools that we will use to solve, you know, the construction of organizations that are not fragile in general. Like it, for the, if at least for the prudent principle that usually people who ask those questions found the abstract solutions good substitutes for actually engaging with things, which I think is already a reason to be skeptical of finding these abstract solutions first. And second, because, I mean, I have the impression that once you're engaged in something that is really exciting politically, the most obvious part, the part that solves the most kind of automatically is that part that we're trying to solve now. Like, it is kind of self-evident that cooperation is a way of doing things, and we have an intuition that it's a good way of doing things, even though it's hard in practice. You know, the simple thing that is so hard to do, as Brecht says. I feel like that's not the part that's hard to theorize. Like, and I'm not sure it's the thing that, you know, all this formal apparatus needs to solve. So,
yeah, but I would say like it does seem like the humanism, the universalism, and the kind of the ethical injunction stuff, that is also part of the composition, right, of individuals. I guess what I mean is like, maybe if we want to put mode D into this box of it's all the gluing that doesn't fit the other modes.
yeah,
right?
exactly. This is what I was gonna say. Like, I have the impression that if we just, I'm honestly like, in between formulation, I would propose just to reject, just because I think it's better than Karatani's, but worse than what we're actually doing. An in-between proposition I would do is just put psychoanalysis where Karatani puts Kant, which is to say, it's not even ethical in the sense that it's a social principle. It's more like a, you know, theory of the drive, Zizek's spirit, blah, 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 which is like asocial. It's more like all the stuff that doesn't form social bonds. Like, that's where most of mode D gets hidden, right? But that's also a poor formulation because psychoanalysis is not really good at talking about the structure of things that happen at this particular level. It just romanticizes them a lot, treat them as being a force that comes from metaphysical principles. It's still more realistic in the sense that it has a better theory of free association, its perils, its contingency than the Kantian, let's follow Kantian philosophy, it will take us from religion to Kant to socialism kind of approach. It recognizes the sociality of it a bit, but it's less strong of a proposal than the one we're making now, which keeps all the benefits from the Kantian and the psychoanalytic approach, which is that thing which is not A, B, and C, that has a history and so on, but doesn't pretend like just because something is allowed to exist as contingent interruptions in the world, that it will hold the key for how to compose the larger picture. That's not a given, right? Like, which is the reason why, even though, let's say, if you take the other modes, even though, I don't know, evaluation of objects as commodities exists from time immemorial as a social principle, none of the social technologies we call capitalism have anything to do with the technologies or social rituals and normative principles that went in evaluating, equivalent objects in like 1,000 years ago. Even if, so just because you get like the accidental principle, you can formulate it, like there is some form of asocial sociality that appears in this and that context, some negativity that breaks with pre-established symbolic forms today, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't mean you've sorted out what does it mean to construct a consistent kind of world out of that. And to assume that because you have like the little dot, like the little bit of it, that you already have a good formulation for the whole, I think gets in the way of actually learning in practice how to build it. It just, is that little kind of, anticipation of something, as Anna said, like a prefiguration that it's a bit too romantic, I find, whereas most of the interesting work seems to appear when you don't assume you already know that answer,
I think that's a really interesting point too, because like I mentioned in the chat, I feel like that's what you're describing with putting psychoanalysis in that spot is basically what Joan Kopchak does. I feel like, and like she's been a point of reference for me to some extent, and also like how I read Karatani, like I know she's a really big fan of his work. I don't know, it's interesting that it's like I agree. Like I feel like the only place where I'd push back on that just a little bit is in the feeling of like, I don't know, in certain frameworks that are sort of more based on the like technological or the like organizational point of view. The one concern that I have is that there is something that gets covered over about what, not necessarily that we should be trying to prefigure things, but almost sort of like if there is a way to phrase the inverse of that, which is that we shouldn't be like, what's the word for it? We shouldn't like not care about how the form that things are taking now, connects to the form that things are taking in the future, in the sense that I guess you could almost put it in terms of like avoiding becoming too much like the things that we're fighting against.
Yeah, but but this is the part that I really can't swallow of this line of argumentation, which I think Zizek makes a lot and so on, which is always sounds like it's more pragmatic, more realistic. Like, but what about what we're doing? This is what I really dislike, which is this idea that everyone who is on team true contradiction, which I don't even think is true, like it's really Hegelian, but anyway, like, let's look at the subversion starts by first looking at what we have now, and there will be a contradiction in that, and this contradiction within the present is the most concrete kind of step forward we have. It always sounds the most kind of pragmatic. It always asks like, this is too idealistic. What about the contradictions we have in real life right now? But it can never do anything with those contradictions. It have no tools to actually be inside those processes and actually build something. It's always pointing to, refugees. Those are contradictions. What about, the housing movement? That's a contradiction. Okay, but fine. It's a bit from afar. And I don't agree that what we're saying here implies, not paying attention to the present. I would say it's the exact opposite. Like, it would be nice to be able to stop discussing this kind of two-part Hegel versus Spinoza kind of caricatures, where some group is like, kudos to everything people are trying to do that is new, and the other is like, no, but we need to engage with the real contradiction and subvert them right now. In actual political practice, nobody thinks in those terms, I think. Like, I mean, I've never seen anyone engage with a political process purely and maintain themselves there because it is a contradiction. Like, if you're not constructing something, you don't stay. But if it's not real, I mean, with actual people doing something actual that has some actual consequence, it doesn't sustain itself in time.
So I mean, the thing is, I actually like, I agree with you, and I also think that I think Zizek, you know, arguably has the same kind of problem as the one that I'm concerned about. Actually, like I don't think that it's that, you know, I mean, and you can argue that maybe that it's, in a sense, the thing that I'm worried about is just a thing that happens no matter no matter what your framework is, you just have to deal with it. But like it's less that I'm talking about, oh, we need to like look for the contradictions and everything. It's more that I'm saying is actually kind of like and this is a point where I've often kind of had issues with Zizek, is like, to what extent are the ways that we are taking action right now, and this is something that is often discussed in political practice, is to what extent are the actions that we're taking right now, you know, too structurally similar to the things that we're fighting against, right? And the idea of there being real contradictions, and to some extent, this is actually how Badiou defends the sort of inconsistency or even paraconsistency in immanence of truths, is the idea that, well, right, we have to have political interventions that are, you know, in a different form from what currently exists, and accept that there is that difference, rather than, you know, sort of competing with what currently exists on the exact playing field that it sets. We have to set a different one and allow that contradiction to be there, because we're not immediately going to have the whole world, you know, wake up to the event or whatever. So in this sense, I actually think Badiou is a lot closer to the kind of point that I'm trying to make than maybe Zizek is. A lot of the time I feel like I don't know, I don't want to turn this into an anti-Zizek thing. I don't know how relevant that is, but I mean, do you get what I'm saying? Like, I think, you know, it doesn't necessarily help to do the old Hegel Spinoza thing, which is actually, it was an interesting connection, but I don't think it's really what I'm trying to get at. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, no, I just worried a bit because, as I told you, like, I don't know, I really just want like to make the stuff we're doing a bit cleaner and solve a bit of its problems. Sometimes I just feel like this mode D discussion, even though I really want to do what we set out to do, which is to describe a bit more clearly what Karatani is doing, most of the time it just sounds to me like asking questions we don't need to answer, rather than questions we don't have answers to. Like, because most of the questions that Mode D actually answers, which are concrete, either historical, political questions, I do think we're slowly getting there, you know? It's just this idea that we should be able to tell apart, or we should be able to kind of have a specific toolkit for solving generally the problem of how to organize like those things that I wonder if this is where we're heading to. Like, I feel like we should, my impression is that personally, I like to have as many words as possible to treat as legitimate as many political processes as possible, and find ways of engaging with as many as possible and how they might be composed together. Like, I think I don't need anything of what we're doing to tell apart where I want to engage and where I don't, or where I can engage and where I can't engage politically. Like, for that, you don't need this, like, you know, but for engaging in a way that you have a rich enough kind of point of view on all of it, that you might not mistake, you know, differences for profound oppositions, or, you know, you might be able to describe things in a way that perhaps a point of decision can be more clearly put, where first you would just glean through it and say, okay, there's nothing to be done here. Like, I think those are the things we can help. So when it starts getting the feeling that you need this sort of stuff we're doing, or some version of it, to identify where you should engage, how you should engage, what you should not engage with, how you should build these connections. Like, those questions, I feel like, if those questions were already answered, engaging with politics would be so boring, I just wouldn't do it. Like, that's the part where the pleasure doing politics comes in, like, that those questions are there to be answered. If they were potentially answered before you started, I think most people would simply not want to engage or at least wouldn't have pleasure in doing so. So that's the part where this connection between religion, philosophy, and socialist politics, this kind of clear history binding all of it, the idea that there's something ethical or kind of a sort of Kantian backdrop to all of this that already points towards it, or that this connection between, you know, which is a common theme, like, well, workers will organize in this way, then the party comes and organizes in that way, and this will lead us forward. Like, I don't know, like, even if that's the case in a certain situation, like the early 20th century Russia or the 50s in Brazil, still it was the case because of contingencies. And that's why people were very excited to learn that that was a way forward. If it was written in stone that that's like transcendentally how we should move forward, it would make politics so boring. You know, it's like if psychoanalysis did have something to say about how to have a healthy, loving relationship, man, it would be the worst news in the world. You know, like, I love it has many concepts to tell how things go wrong, why things go wrong, and all these different crazy challenges, but it doesn't have much to say on how you should do things. That's still up to you. I feel like it's a similar position. And when it looks like no, but there is this logic of love, and if you follow it, it's kind of the right way. I feel like it's gonna be like we pull our own carpet, you know, like it would be the inverse of bootstrapping, both unstrapping. I don't know how you would call it. Like, it would undo the very thing we would like to be doing.
Yeah, I think this is why I'm thinking of STP as we are theorizing at the n equals greater than 1, whatever you start at 0, then 1 or greater, because what Anna's describing here, this, or what you call the asocial sociality, the psychoanalytic stuff, that's kind of a black box for us, right? Like, that's why I wrote in the picture, bring your own normative principles, because by the time you're in the STP world of the theoretical stuff we're building, that stuff is already in place. Like, we have already assumed that people have different commitments and different like points of view and all that stuff, and different illusions or symptoms that drive them. But the point is, once you have that diversity of positions, then there's still this work that has to be done to compose them.
I mean, that makes sense. And in general, like, I think it's a very good point and it's very convincing. But I don't know, there is a certain kind of, I guess, because, you know, Gabrielle, like you put it, like, psychoanalysis has a lot of tools to help you, not to tell you, you know, how to have a good relationship or whatever, but to help you, like, you know, be able to effectively diagnose to some extent when things are going wrong in a certain way, right? So I feel like, if anything, like, it's more like, I think it wouldn't be such a bad thing to think of it in terms of, you know, whatever is left in the space where we're not sort of actively diagnosing all of these other things that are going wrong or could go wrong or whatever. That I feel like there is sort of room for, like, I don't know, and a lot of this comes out of, like, from my own experience of organizing, where, like, I mean, like, I was working for a long time, I was working with Maoists, you know, and I was working with, you know, a lot of people who had a very, very sort of specific idea of, like, you know, what a revolution should be or what it should look like. And I was in this position often of kind of negotiating between people with this sort of always trying to radicalize every situation, and then sort of community leaders who were very skeptical of this, and then people in the community who maybe would be wanting to also do the really radical stuff, and then people who wouldn't. And it was sort of just this, like, this whole process of trying to deal with you know, particular visions of what these things should be, and just sort of questioning, like, you know, I mean, at a certain point, and also all of these crazy personal things happen within the organizations, and I kind of had this point where I was like, but what is, like, you know, what is this accomplishing, right? What are the things that are going wrong, right? So I think it's not so bad to some extent to have to point to something, especially also when you're actually engaging with people. This is a huge thing that we see, was where, like, you know, for whatever we think about them, groups like PSL have this amazing literature. You know, Marxist-Leninist Party, they have this amazing literature on like, you know, what socialism will look like. Here's what it would look like. It can be this and this and this and this. And it's based off of the Soviet Union, right? And that's actually fairly convincing to people. Like there's in Philly right now, like, but it's like, I'm not saying we should do exactly that same thing, but instead of what I'm saying is that like we should be able to at least have some way to respond to it effectively.
But Anna, this is just to make clear like this. Of course, you should produce this material and should think exactly how the future societies will look like. Just, you don't need category theory. You shouldn't do this alone outside of a movement. This is a political question, and you should answer it with other people, engaging with political conditions that make sense where you're working and acting and so on. Like, it's not a matter of emptying out the merits of every constructive political endeavor. It's just removing it from a place that cannot do it, which is small group of people in front of like a blackboard, which is kind of what we're doing. Like, there are some things you can do in front of a blackboard, and we're trying to focus on those. There are some things that it's simply not a good idea to try to solve that way. And, you know, when you mentioned this one day, and I told you this, like, if you found a way of applying Karatani to some political work you were doing, that's the merit of the political work you were doing, not the merit of Karatani. Because people have found like ways of applying, you know, all sorts of curious theoretical stuff to politics. But when you apply to politics, when you use it in politics, first, you're not doing philosophy. It's not most of like the crazy philosophical ideas people came up with in political life. They were just forgotten because they weren't like engaged in the philosophical debate. They weren't engaged with Kant. They were engaged with events in their struggle. And it's okay that it's not the same thing. So there is a place where this kind of, I think that we have this triad that is very hard to respect it between philosophy asking like these big categorical questions. And I think we managed to avoid most of the time doing philosophy. Then there is this new thing we're trying to do, which is a kind of meta-politics, which is like the most prescriptive thing it gets to do is a bit like analysis, which is undoing some false generalizations, right? It's a bit therapeutic in the way, like saying, perhaps you cannot generalize this principle to be applied everywhere. Perhaps this question is not answered already. You need to go back to political struggles and answer it again, right? It takes a lot of work to empty out those presuppositions. And curiously enough, a bunch of other questions get to be answered when you do that. But those two levels are not the same as, let's say, the discourse, the thinking, the traditions, the constructions, the imagination you come up with when you're actually doing stuff, right? I think we're very much in the fringe here between like developing the means to erase some presuppositions that get in the way of realizing that, for example, when you organize, you can organize with Maoists for a while and then do something else like that. That's fine, you know. And somehow those Maoists and the social democrats, they feel kind of the same. They're part of the same thing in a way. What is that same thing? How do you name that same thing? How do you account for the, you know, like that's something I think we're trying to do. But then when you're actually engaged with people and like everything changes, and what's meaningful while you're constructing an organization or doing some particular type of political work, how you should use the tradition, what's meaningful there, what is not, what does it mean to be rigorous, what doesn't mean, like all those things change. Doesn't need to have the same criteria for all those levels, right? To be philosophically rigorous, to be rigorous in what we're doing here, and to be rigorous or truthful in some political activity, those things don't need to line up. And I feel like the Modi thing is a bit of a plea to make all those things line up a bit too much. Because, you know, if you treat it as political discourse, Karatani made use of philosophy to propose a movement in Japan. It worked in part, but it didn't work in part. We could judge also the merits of his proposal based on the failings and shortcomings of his political movement, right? It's different from judging like the fine letter of the law if he gave a good reading of Kant. So, I feel like these levels are different.
No, I agree. Like I think that little last little monologue was the most helpful one so far. I mean, I think that one thing I would say then is that like maybe some of these resources that are going into this particular discussion should really go into talking about like, well, what is metapolitics for STP, and like we're trying to address that problem, because in a way it's sort of like.
But you see, this is where see the trick there, like. But then let's ask, what is metapolitics? And now we're doing philosophy. Like, we have a bunch of questions that we can answer, and then if we don't manage to answer them, then we can step back and say, perhaps we framed them wrong. But to stop answering those questions, like how do these different logics come together? Do they really explain like how secondary, like students organize and then organize into movements or not? Like to step back and ask, but what is metapolitics? Like, we're back at we're out of metapolitics, back into philosophy.
Okay, that's true, but
it's so complicated.
You get the point though of at the very least, like if people like me are coming in here and having these questions, it's like there has to be some way to at least like diffuse them.
No,
right?
you're totally right.
That's all I'm saying.
No, you're totally right, and I have no idea how to do that. Like I feel it's very similar to what happens in psychoanalysis, where you're not telling people what to do. They have their love lives. So you're not at the level of actual relationships. You don't know anything about those things, and you want to listen to people to know what's going on. So you're in a kind of meta-amorous place. But every time you get embarrassed with that meta level, you ask questions which prevent you from actually listening and take you now from a third level, which is like philosophy. And then you end up saying, yeah, but psychoanalysis is all about the real of sexual non-relation because one is actually divided into two. And suddenly you're neither in an amorous relation, nor in a position to listen to amorous relationships and in a helpful way. You're now in a third place. So it's like a weird dialectics where there is politics, there is trying to put yourself in a position where you can listen to political processes in a productive way. And once you're embarrassed with the fact that listening to politics is not the same as actively being engaged, and you ask, but what is this metapolitics? Then you are in a third thing, which is no longer the thing you were doing before. So it's a mess, and I don't know. It's a problem.
No,
I totally agree with you.
That's a great way of putting it, though. That's a great, like that you're saying it's a mess, but that's already a great beginning of diagnosing it.
Yeah, and I do think that we're probably going to have to be patient a bit and stick with that mess until we manage to get some more ground covered, because the other option, which is actually aligning things better, well, love relationships are all about, your dealings with the other. Well, ultimately, that's what Kantian ethics was all about. So there is actually, living an amorous relationship that poses a problem about the other, which is answered by the philosophical level. I'm not sure. Like, I can see that similar thing being done in politics. Like, political life is very complex. People are not getting along. That problem has to do with, how to associate movements. That takes us to, the issue of what is the desirable picture we can speculate about communist society, and then we top down bring it back, and we always look like idiots. I don't know if it's because if you look around, like people really don't care about, like you're not going to be able to do much by philosophically sorting out these problems. So I don't know, it's a mess. I think that's the conclusion I would arrive. I trust that this mess is productive for now, at least.
No, I mean, I trust it too. If I didn't, I wouldn't be here.
Well, that's comforting. Okay.
We should probably wrap up.
We should wrap up, definitely. Okay. Sleep well.
See you.
Bye-bye.